Chapter 1. It was a cloudy morning in October. The sun wasn't shining, and it looked like rain. I wore my neat blue suit. I was clean, shaved, and ready for work. I am a private detective. My name is Philip Marlowe. I went to the Sternwood Mansion. The house was huge and fancy. Inside, the hallway was 2 stories high. Over the front doors, there was a stained glass window. It showed a knight trying to save a woman tied to a tree. Her long hair covered her body. The knight looked stuck, as if he couldn't untie her. The hallway had a grand staircase and big, heavy chairs. There was a large fireplace with a painting above it. The painting showed a man in an old military uniform. He had sharp, black eyes that seemed tough. I guessed he was the grandfather of General Sternwood, the owner of the house. I waited. Then, a young woman walked in. She was about 20 years old, small, and dressed in blue slacks. She had short, light brown hair and gray eyes. She smiled at me and said, "You're tall." I said, "I didn't mean to be." She giggled. She thought I was handsome and asked if I was a boxer. I said, "No, I'm a detective." Suddenly, she leaned back and fell into my arms. I had to catch her. She giggled again. "You're cute," she said. At that moment, the butler came in. He didn't seem surprised. "The general will see you now, Mr. Marlowe," he said. I put the girl down and she ran upstairs. The butler told me her name was Carmen Sternwood. She was one of the general's daughters. I followed the butler to meet the general. Chapter 2. The butler led me outside through a side door. We walked on a stone path past a green lawn and a greenhouse. The greenhouse was large, with a glass dome on top. The butler opened the door, and we stepped inside. The air was hot, wet, and smelled strange, like flowers and chemicals. The greenhouse was filled with orchids, big, colorful flowers. Their leaves looked thick and strange, almost like human skin. We walked through the plants to a clear space in the middle. There was an old man sitting in a wheelchair. He looked very weak and sick. His face was thin, and his hands were bony, with purple nails. He was wrapped in a blanket. This was General Sternwood. The butler introduced me, then left. The general's voice was weak, but he spoke clearly. "Do you drink brandy, Mr. Marlowe?" he asked. "I'll drink it however you like," I replied. He told me to take off my coat because it was too hot. I sat down and lit a cigarette. He said he didn't mind the smell of tobacco. The general talked about his life. He told me he couldn't eat much, and he couldn't sleep well. He said he stayed alive for his orchids, even though he didn't like them. "They are strange flowers," he said. "They smell bad, like something rotten." Then he got to the point. He wanted me to help him with a problem. His younger daughter, Carmen, had been involved with a man named Arthur Gwynne Geiger. Geiger was trying to blackmail him with gambling debts that Carmen owed. The general didn't know Geiger and wanted me to handle the matter quietly. "I'll pay you $25 a day, plus expenses," the general said. "Can you take care of this?" I agreed. Before I left, he mentioned another man, Rusty Reagan. Reagan was his other daughter's husband. A month ago, Rusty disappeared without a word. The general seemed sad about this, but didn't ask me to look for him. The butler returned to take me out. As we walked, he said, "Mrs. Regan, the general's elder daughter, wants to see you." I followed him into another part of the house. Chapter 3. The butler took me to a big room. It was very fancy, but felt cold and empty. The carpet was white, and the furniture was ivory with shiny metal. Big mirrors covered the walls. A woman was lying on a long chair. She was tall and slim, with black hair and dark eyes. She wore silk stockings, and her legs were on display. This was Mrs. Vivian Regan, the general's older daughter. She looked at me coolly. "So, you're a private detective," she said. "You don't look like one." She asked if I had met her father and how I liked him. I told her he was fine. Then she talked about her husband, Rusty Regan. She said her father liked Rusty and missed him since he disappeared. "He wants you to find him, doesn't he?" she asked. I didn't answer directly. "Maybe," I said. She didn't seem happy with my answer. Vivian was sharp and pushy. She kept asking questions about Rusty and my work. I stayed calm and didn't give her much information. "I didn't come here to talk about Rusty," I said. This made her angry. She slammed her drink down, stood up, and shouted at me. "Get out!" she yelled. Then, just as suddenly, she told me to sit back down. She was trying to act tough, but I could tell she was nervous about something. "Rusty left a month ago," she said finally. "He just drove off one day and never came back. His car was found later in a garage." I nodded. "If your father wants me to look into it, I will." Vivian looked frustrated. "Forget it," she said. "You can go." I left the room and headed out of the house. As I walked down the driveway, I thought about Vivian. She was beautiful, but she was also trouble. Chapter 4. Arthur Gwynne Geiger had a bookstore on Hollywood Boulevard. The store's front was fancy, with copper trim and Chinese decorations in the windows. I went inside. The store was dimly lit, with soft carpets and leather chairs. Expensive books were on display in glass cases. A woman sat at a desk near the back. She was tall and blonde, with shiny nails and smooth hair. She looked elegant but not very friendly. She walked toward me with a fake smile. "Can I help you?" she asked. I spoke politely but tested her knowledge. "Do you have a rare copy of Ben-Hur, 3rd edition from 1860? I asked. She hesitated and said, "Not at the moment." Then I asked for another rare book, but she didn't know that one either. It was clear she didn't know much about books. I told her I would wait. I sat in a chair and smoked a cigarette. She went back to her desk and watched me closely. After a while, a thin man with a cane came into the store. He handed her a package and she pressed a button on her desk. He went through a door at the back of the store and came out later with another package. He paid her and left. I decided to follow the man. He walked quickly, swinging his cane. When he noticed me, he started walking even faster and turned onto a side street. I saw him slip behind a tree in a small courtyard. I waited, pretending not to notice him. After a while, he came back out, whistling nervously, and left. I went to the tree where he had been hiding. Behind it, I found a wrapped package. I took it and opened it later in my car. It was a book, but not a normal one. The book was full of dirty pictures. It was clear that Geiger's bookstore was a front for something illegal, selling smut. I wrapped the book again and decided to visit Geiger's house. Chapter 5. I found Geiger's address in the phone book. His house was on a hillside street called Laverne Terrace. It was a quiet neighborhood with small houses surrounded by trees and bushes. I parked my car near Geiger's house and waited to see what would happen. After a while, a fancy car stopped in front of the house. Geiger got out. He was a short, heavy man wearing a green leather raincoat. He carried an umbrella and went into the house. A young man parked the car in the garage and left. The house lights turned on, but everything stayed quiet. I sat in my car and watched. It was raining hard now. After some time, another car arrived. This one was a maroon Packard convertible. A woman got out of it. She was small and slim, wearing a raincoat and a hat. I recognized her. It was Carmen Sternwood. She rang the doorbell, and Geiger let her in. I waited outside, but nothing happened for a long time. Suddenly, I saw a flash of bright light from inside the house. A second later, I heard a scream. It was loud and strange, like someone laughing and crying at the same time. I got out of my car and ran toward the house. Before I reached the door, I heard 3 gunshots. Then, I heard footsteps running inside the house. A moment later, I heard a car start and drive away quickly. I went to the side of the house and looked through a window. The curtains were closed, so I couldn't see much. I used my hat to break the glass and unlocked the window. Then I climbed inside. The room was fancy and filled with Chinese decorations. There was a strange chair shaped like a throne and a large rug on the floor. Geiger was lying on the rug. He was dead. His body was covered in blood, and his glass eye stared up at the ceiling. In the chair, Carmen was sitting, completely naked. She looked dazed, as if she didn't know where she was. Her eyes were wide, and she kept giggling softly. There was a camera in the room, pointed right at her. It seemed Geiger had been taking pictures of her before he was killed. I looked around but didn't find anything important. The camera didn't have its film plate, so the photos were missing. Someone must have taken them. I found Carmen's clothes and helped her get dressed. She could barely move and kept giggling. She smelled like ether, a drug. I carried her out to her car and drove her home. She was unconscious by the time I reached the Sternwood mansion. I rang the bell, and the butler answered. He didn't seem surprised to see Carmen in such a state. "She needs help," I said. He nodded and called for one of the maids to take care of her. I left the house, wondering what had really happened at Geiger's. Chapter 6. After dropping Carmen off at her house, I went back to Geiger's place. The rain had stopped, but the streets were wet and quiet. I parked my car and walked back to the house. Everything looked the same from the outside. I unlocked the door and went in. Inside, the house was dark and quiet. I turned on a lamp and noticed something strange right away. Geiger's body was gone. The rug where his body had been was now flat and clean, but I could see faint marks where something heavy had been dragged toward the door. I searched the house. Nothing seemed out of place except for a few missing decorations on the walls. I checked all the rooms. Geiger's bedroom was neat and full of personal items like clothes, brushes, and perfume. There was another locked door in the hallway. Using Geiger's keys, I opened it. The locked room was plain and masculine, very different from the rest of the house. It had a hard bed, a few chairs, and a dark wooden dresser. There wasn't much to see, and Geiger wasn't there either. I went back to the main room and examined the camera again. There was still no film in it. Whoever had killed Geiger had taken the film and cleaned up quickly. I couldn't figure out who had removed the body, but I knew it wasn't the police. If it had been, the house would still be crawling with officers. I left the house and went home. After changing out of my wet clothes and having some dinner, I started looking through a notebook I had taken from Geiger's desk. The notebook was filled with names and addresses, all written in a strange code. I guessed it was a list of Geiger's customers, probably people who bought illegal books or were being blackmailed. There were hundreds of names. I stayed up late trying to crack the code, but it didn't make any sense to me. I went to bed frustrated, thinking about the missing body, the stolen photos, and what might happen next. Chapter 7. The next morning was sunny and bright, but I still had a lot on my mind. I couldn't stop thinking about Geiger's missing body and the strange events at his house. After breakfast, I read the morning newspapers, but there was no mention of a murder or anything about Geiger. Later, I got a phone call from Bernie Oles, the chief investigator for the district attorney. He had given me the lead to work for General Sternwood. Bernie sounded cheerful. "Hey, how's it going?" he asked. "Could be better," I replied. He said, "There's news you might find interesting. A big Buick sedan was pulled out of the ocean near the Lido Fish Pier this morning. And guess what? There was a dead guy inside it." I froze. "Who was it?" I asked. "Not Reagan," Bernie said, referring to Rusty Reagan. "This was a young kid, slim and dark-haired." I didn't say anything for a moment. Bernie continued, "You want to come check it out? I'm heading there now." I agreed and got ready quickly. Within an hour, I met Bernie at his office. He looked calm and professional, as usual. We drove down the coast to Lido, a small fishing area. It was a clear day, and the sea smelled fresh, but the scene we found was anything but pleasant. The car had been pulled out of the water onto a barge. It was a mess, wet, scratched, and covered in sand. Inside, the body of a young man was still slumped over the steering wheel. His head was twisted at an odd angle, and his face was pale and bruised. He had been hit on the side of the head before the car went into the water. Bernie and I looked at each other. "Doesn't look like an accident," Bernie said. The pier where the car had gone off was damaged. The wooden railing was broken, and the tire marks showed the car had driven straight through it. But it didn't add up. Someone had clearly set the car to crash on purpose. Bernie asked the workers what they thought. One man guessed it was suicide. Another thought it was murder. I kept quiet and let them talk. The details of this case didn't seem simple. I wondered if this dead man was somehow connected to Geiger or to the Sternwood family. Bernie didn't push me for answers. After we finished examining the scene, we drove back toward the city. On the way, I kept thinking about the dead man, the missing photos, and where Geiger's body might have gone. Nothing about this case made sense yet. Chapter 8. That evening, I returned to Geiger's house. Everything was quiet, and no one was there. When I went inside, I saw something new. The rug where Geiger's body had been was gone. Whoever cleaned up had removed more things, including decorations from the walls. I searched the house again, but I didn't find Geiger's body. I checked the locked room again, but it was empty too. It felt like someone wanted to erase all traces of what had happened. I went back home, frustrated. After dinner, I looked at the notebook I had taken from Geiger's desk. It was full of names and addresses written in a strange code. I couldn't figure out the code, but I knew it was important. Probably a list of customers or victims of blackmail. I stayed up late thinking about everything. The missing body, the photos, and the dead man in the car. Nothing added up yet. Chapter 9. The next morning, I got a call from Bernie Oles. He said, "A big Buick sedan was found in the ocean, and there was a dead man inside. It wasn't Rusty Regan, though. This was a young guy." Bernie asked if I wanted to come with him to check it out, and I agreed. We drove to the Lido Pier. The car had been pulled out of the water onto a barge. It was scratched and waterlogged. Inside, a young man's body was slumped over the wheel. His face was pale, and he had a bruise on his head. Bernie thought it wasn't an accident. The car had been driven off the pier on purpose. We checked the broken railing where the car had gone off. Tire marks showed it went straight through. One of the workers thought it might be suicide, but it didn't make sense. The hand throttle in the car was set, and the man had clearly been hit on the head. As we drove back, I couldn't stop thinking about the dead man and how it connected to Geiger. The case was getting more complicated, and I didn't have any answers yet. Chapter 10. Later that day, I decided to visit Joe Brody, a man the general had mentioned before. He was a gambler who had once blackmailed Carmen Sternwood. I thought he might know something about Geiger or the missing photos. Joe lived in a cheap apartment. I knocked on his door and he opened it just a little. He was a tough-looking guy in his 30s. When I told him my name, he didn't seem happy to see me. I pushed my way inside and asked him about Geiger. Joe got nervous. He said he didn't know much, but I could tell he was lying. I also brought up the photos. His face changed. He knew exactly what I was talking about. As I questioned him, I realized Joe might have been at Geiger's house the night of the murder. He didn't admit it, but his nervousness gave him away. I didn't press too hard. I left Joe's apartment, but I knew I'd have to deal with him again soon. Chapter 11. That night, I went back to Geiger's house. It was dark and quiet, but I noticed something different. The house was being watched. A car was parked nearby with someone sitting inside. I decided to wait and see what would happen. After some time, I saw a man sneak into Geiger's house. It was Joe Brody. I stayed outside, watching. A few minutes later, a young woman approached the house. It was Agnes, the blonde woman from Geiger's bookstore. She knocked on the door, and Joe let her in. I waited a bit longer and then decided to go inside. When I knocked, Joe opened the door with a gun in his hand. "What do you want?" he asked nervously. I calmly pushed past him and walked into the house. Inside, Agnes looked frightened. Joe was clearly on edge. I told Joe I knew he had the missing photos from Geiger's camera. At first, he denied it, but I kept pressing him. Finally, he admitted it. He said he took the photos after Geiger was killed because he thought he could sell them for money. As we talked, there was a loud knock at the door. Joe hesitated but opened it. To my surprise, Carmen Sternwood walked in. She was angry and demanded the photos. Joe panicked and pointed his gun at her. Before things could get worse, I grabbed the gun from him and made everyone sit down. I told Joe to hand over the photos. He finally gave them to me. Carmen wanted them back, but I told her I would take care of it. She stormed out of the house, furious. With the photos in my hand, I left Joe and Agnes behind. Things were starting to make sense, but I still had more to figure out. Chapter 12. After leaving Geiger's house, I decided to visit Eddie Mars. He was a shady businessman who owned a nightclub and might know more about the case. Eddie had a reputation for being involved in illegal activities, and I suspected he was connected to Geiger. The nightclub was busy, with music and people dancing. I asked one of the staff to take me to Eddie's office. Eddie was a smooth-talking man, dressed sharply in a suit. He greeted me politely but kept a careful eye on me. I asked him about Geiger and whether he knew anything about the murder. Eddie didn't admit much, but he clearly knew more than he let on. He mentioned that Geiger had enemies and hinted that the missing body might have been part of a cover-up. I also brought up Rusty Regan, the general's missing son-in-law. Eddie smirked and said, "Everyone's looking for Rusty, but I don't think he wants to be found." His words made me wonder if Eddie knew where Rusty was. Before I left, Eddie warned me to be careful. "You're playing a dangerous game, Marlowe," he said. I nodded and left the club, knowing I was getting closer to the truth, but also closer to trouble. Chapter 13. The next day, I returned to the Sternwood mansion. I wanted to talk to the general and tell him what I had found so far. The butler let me in, and I was taken to the general's greenhouse again. The room was hot and filled with the smell of orchids. The general looked weak, but was still alert. I told him about Geiger's death, the missing photos, and how Joe Brody had tried to use them for blackmail. He listened carefully, nodding slowly as I explained. I didn't mention Carmen's involvement with the photos yet, thinking it might upset him. The general asked if I had learned anything about Rusty Regan. I told him the truth. I hadn't found anything useful about Rusty's disappearance yet. He sighed and said, "Rusty was a good man. I hope he's safe, wherever he is." Before I left, the general thanked me for helping him and handed me a check for my work so far. I told him I would continue looking into the case and figure out what was really going on. As I drove away from the mansion, I thought about all the pieces of the puzzle: Geiger's murder, the blackmail photos, and Rusty's disappearance. I had more work to do, and I knew things would get more dangerous from here. Chapter 14. I decided to follow up on Eddie Mars. Something about him didn't sit right with me, and I felt he was hiding more than he said. Eddie owned a gambling house outside the city, so I drove there to see if I could learn more. The place was quiet, with a few cars parked outside. Inside, men were playing cards at several tables. The room smelled of cigars and whiskey. Eddie wasn't on the floor, so I asked one of the staff for him. They pointed me to a private office upstairs. When I entered, Eddie greeted me with his usual calm smile. He acted friendly, but I knew he didn't trust me. I asked him again about Rusty Regan, pushing harder this time. Eddie shrugged and said, "Why are you so interested in Rusty? Maybe he just left because he wanted to." I told Eddie that the general cared about Rusty and wanted answers. Eddie leaned back in his chair and said, "If you're looking for trouble, you're in the right place. Be careful, Marlowe." I left the office feeling like Eddie knew more than he let on. As I walked out of the gambling house, I noticed a woman watching me from a corner. She was young, with dark hair and sharp eyes. She quickly looked away when I saw her. I didn't know who she was, but I had a feeling she wasn't just a random gambler. The case was getting more complicated, and I knew I had to stay sharp. Chapter 15. I kept an eye on the dark-haired woman I had seen at Eddie Mars's gambling house. She left the building shortly after I did, so I decided to follow her. She got into a car and drove off. I stayed far enough behind so she wouldn't notice me. She drove through the city and eventually stopped at a small house in a quiet neighborhood. I parked nearby and waited to see what she would do. She went inside, and the house stayed dark. I decided not to approach yet and returned to my apartment. The next day, I started asking questions about Eddie Mars and his connections. I learned that the house the woman went to was owned by Eddie. It seemed like he was hiding something, or someone there. I went back to the house later that evening. This time I knocked on the door. The woman opened it and looked startled to see me. "Who are you?" she asked. I told her my name and said I wanted to talk about Eddie Mars. She looked nervous but let me inside. The house was small and plain, but it felt tense. The woman wouldn't give me much information. "I don't know anything about Eddie's business," she said. I didn't believe her but decided not to push too hard. As I left, I couldn't shake the feeling that Eddie was hiding something important in that house. It might even be connected to Rusty Regan's disappearance. I knew I'd have to return. Chapter 16. I decided to visit the small house near Eddie Mars's gambling den again. Something about it didn't feel right, and I was sure it held answers I needed. This time, I came prepared to push harder for the truth. When I knocked on the door, the dark-haired woman opened it. She wasn't happy to see me. "Why are you here again?" she asked. I told her I wanted to know what Eddie was hiding. She tried to act innocent, but her nervous behavior gave her away. I stepped inside without waiting for permission. The house felt quiet and tense, as if someone else might be hiding there. I asked her directly, "Is Rusty Regan here? What does Eddie Mars have to do with him?" The woman hesitated but didn't answer. I heard a faint noise from another room. I moved toward the sound, but she blocked my way. "You need to leave," she said firmly. I ignored her and opened the door. The room was empty, but something about it seemed recently used. The woman became more nervous. "You're making a mistake," she said. "You don't know what you're getting into." I left the house, knowing I was close to uncovering something big. Eddie Mars was clearly involved in something dangerous, and the woman was protecting him, or someone else. I was getting closer to the truth, but I knew I had to be careful. Chapter 17. The next day, I decided to dig deeper into Eddie Mars's activities. I spoke with a few of my contacts around the city. They all said the same thing. Eddie was powerful, dangerous, and knew how to keep secrets. I returned to the small house later that night. This time, I stayed outside and watched from a distance. After a while, I saw a man arrive. He parked his car and went inside. I couldn't see his face clearly, but he didn't look like Eddie Mars. He stayed for about an hour and then left. I followed the man in my car. He drove across town to a rundown apartment building. I waited until he went inside. Then I noted the address. I didn't know who he was yet, but I was sure he was connected to Eddie in the house. The next morning, I went to the apartment building and found out the man's name. He was a small-time crook with ties to Eddie Mars. I guessed he was running errands for Eddie or delivering messages. I decided to confront Eddie directly. I went back to his gambling house and found him in his office. I told him I knew about the house and the man I had followed. Eddie just smiled. "You're good at snooping, Marlowe," he said. "But be careful. You don't want to get in over your head." Eddie wasn't giving me anything useful, but I could see I was getting under his skin. I left, knowing I was closer to the answers I was looking for. Chapter 18. I knew Eddie Mars was hiding something, but I didn't know what. I decided to keep watching him. I went back to the small house where I had seen the dark-haired woman. This time, I stayed hidden outside to see what would happen. After some time, a man came to the house. He knocked on the door, and the woman let him in. I couldn't see much, but it looked like they talked for a while. Then the man left. I followed him in my car. The man drove to an old apartment building. I wrote down the address and waited. The next morning, I asked around about him. People said he worked for Eddie Mars. He wasn't important, but he was doing something for Eddie. I went to see Eddie again at his gambling house. When I walked into his office, he smiled like he wasn't worried. I asked him about the man I had followed. Eddie said, "You're digging too deep, Marlowe. Be careful." Eddie was calm, but I could tell he didn't like me asking questions. I left, but I knew I was getting closer to the truth. Eddie Mars was definitely hiding something big. Chapter 19. I decided to go back to the small house one more time. I knew something important was being hidden there. This time I didn't wait outside. I went straight to the door and knocked. The dark-haired woman opened the door. She looked scared. "What do you want now?" she asked. "I need to know the truth," I said. "What are you and Eddie Mars hiding here?" She shook her head. "You need to leave," she said. But I pushed past her and went inside. The house was quiet, but I heard a noise from one of the rooms. I moved toward it. The woman tried to stop me, but I opened the door. Inside, there was a man sitting in the corner. He looked shocked to see me. It was Rusty Regan. Rusty didn't speak at first. He looked nervous and tired. The woman stood behind me, angry. "You shouldn't have come here," she said. "This is going to cause trouble." I turned to Rusty. "The general has been looking for you. I said. Why are you hiding? Rusty didn't answer right away. Then he said quietly, It's not safe for me to go back. I knew this was a big discovery, but I needed to be careful. Eddie Mars wouldn't like that I had found Rusty. I left the house knowing that the mystery was finally starting to come together. Chapter 20. After finding Rusty Regan, I knew things were going to get dangerous. I left the house quickly and thought about what to do next. The general wanted to know where Rusty was, but I needed to figure out why Rusty was hiding first. I decided to visit Eddie Mars again. He had to be involved in this somehow. When I got to his gambling house, Eddie was in his office. He looked calm, but I could see he didn't trust me. You've been busy, Marlowe, Eddie said. What do you want this time? I found Rusty, I said. Eddie didn't react much, but I could tell he wasn't happy. Why are you keeping him hidden? I asked. Eddie leaned back in his chair. Rusty's not my problem, he said. If he's hiding, he has his reasons. I didn't believe him, but I didn't push too hard. Eddie was dangerous, and I needed to be careful. Before I left, Eddie gave me a warning. Stay out of my business, Marlowe. You don't know who you're messing with. I walked out of the gambling house thinking about Eddie's words. He was clearly hiding something big, and now I was right in the middle of it. Chapter 21. I needed to figure out why Rusty Regan was hiding. I decided to watch Eddie Mars closely. He seemed to be at the center of everything. I spent the evening near his gambling house, looking for clues. Late at night, I saw Eddie leave the building with a couple of men. They got into a car and drove off. I followed them at a distance. They went to a small bar on the edge of town. I stayed outside, watching. After some time, Eddie's men came out of the bar alone. They looked serious and left in a different car. I decided to go inside the bar to see if Eddie was still there. Inside, the bar was quiet. Eddie was sitting at a corner table talking to someone. He didn't notice me at first. I sat at the bar and pretended to have a drink. I listened carefully but couldn't hear what they were saying. When Eddie spotted me, he smiled. Marlowe, you just can't stay away, can you? He said. I stayed calm and replied, Just checking in, Eddie. Always good to see you. Eddie didn't say much after that. He left soon after, but I could tell he was watching me carefully. I knew I was getting close to something, but I didn't know what yet. Chapter 22. I kept thinking about Eddie Mars and his connection to Rusty Regan. I decided to go back to the small house where I had found Rusty. This time, I wanted answers. When I arrived, the dark-haired woman opened the door. She looked worried. What are you doing here again? She asked. I need to talk to Rusty, I said. She hesitated but let me inside. Rusty was sitting in the same room as before. He looked tired and nervous. Why are you hiding here? I asked him directly. The general has been looking for you. Rusty sighed. I had to leave, he said. It wasn't safe for me anymore. There are people who want me dead. I asked him who was after him, but he didn't give a clear answer. He just said, If I go back, they'll find me. It was clear Rusty was scared, but I needed more information. I told him, The general deserves to know the truth. He's worried about you. Rusty didn't reply, but I could see he was thinking about it. I left the house, knowing I still had a lot of work to do to uncover the whole story. Chapter 23. After leaving Rusty, I decided to dig deeper into Eddie Mars. I needed to find out why he was protecting Rusty and what his plan was. Eddie had too many secrets, and I was sure he was involved in something big. I went back to Eddie's gambling house and watched from a distance. Late at night, I saw one of Eddie's men leave the building. He got into a car and drove off. I followed him. The man drove to a warehouse on the edge of the city. It was dark and quiet. I stayed outside, hidden in the shadows. After a while, the man came out with another person. I couldn't see the second person clearly, but they both got into the car and left. I followed them again. This time they went to Eddie Mars' house. The two men went inside and stayed there. I waited outside for a long time, but nothing happened. It was clear that Eddie was moving people and keeping them hidden. I didn't know if it was connected to Rusty or something else, but I was getting closer to the truth. Chapter 24. I decided it was time to confront Eddie Mars directly. I needed answers, and I knew I wouldn't get them by waiting around. I went to his house the next evening and knocked on the door. Eddie opened the door himself. He looked surprised to see me but kept his calm smile. "Marlowe," he said, "you don't give up, do you?" "No, I don't," I replied. "We need to talk." He invited me inside. The house was big and luxurious, but it felt empty and cold. Eddie sat down in a chair and gestured for me to sit too. "So, what's on your mind?" he asked. "I know you're hiding something," I said. "What's your connection to Rusty Regan? Why are your men sneaking around?" Eddie laughed softly. "You've got quite an imagination," he said. "Rusty isn't my problem, and my men do what I tell them. That's all." I didn't believe him. Eddie was too smooth, too calm. "You're lying," I said. "You know where Rusty is, and you're protecting him. Why?" Eddie's smile faded slightly. "Be careful, Marlowe," he said. "You're asking dangerous questions." Before I could press him further, one of his men entered the room. Eddie stood up and said, "I think we're done here." I knew I wouldn't get more out of him tonight, so I left. Outside, I thought about what Eddie had said. He was hiding something, but I was getting closer to the truth. Chapter 25. I couldn't trust Eddie Mars, but I was determined to find the truth. The next day, I went back to the Sternwood mansion to update the general. In the greenhouse, I told him I had found Rusty. The general looked relieved, but also confused. "Why is he hiding?" he asked. "Rusty says it's not safe for him to return," I explained. "He's afraid of someone." The general sighed. "I don't care about his reasons. I just want to know he's alive." I promised the general I would try to find a way to bring Rusty back safely. As I left, I realized the case was almost over, but not quite. Eddie Mars was still a threat, and I needed to deal with him before everything was resolved. Chapter 26. I decided to make one final move against Eddie Mars. I went back to his gambling house that night. This time, I wasn't going to leave without real answers. I found Eddie in his office as usual. He looked calm, but I could see he was tense. "Back again, Marlowe?" he said. You're persistent. I know everything now, Eddie, I said. I know about Rusty and why he's hiding. You've been pulling the strings all along. Eddie's smile disappeared. You don't know as much as you think, he said. I leaned closer. Rusty is scared of you, but the general wants him back. You can't stop that. Eddie didn't reply. He just stared at me, his jaw tight. I could tell he wasn't going to admit anything, but I had enough evidence to make his life difficult. I left the gambling house, knowing I had shaken Eddie. The truth was finally coming together, and soon this case would be over. Chapter 27. The next day, I visited Rusty Regan again. I told him the general wanted him to come back. Rusty looked tired and worried. I can't go back, he said. It's too dangerous. I asked him, What are you so afraid of? Eddie Mars? Rusty nodded slowly. Eddie has too much power. If I return, he'll find me, and it won't end well. I tried to convince him. The general just wants to know you're safe. I can handle Eddie Mars. Rusty stayed quiet for a moment. Then he said, Maybe it's time to stop running. I'll think about it. I left the house, hoping Rusty would change his mind. The case was almost solved, but I knew the danger wasn't over yet. Chapter 28. I decided to put more pressure on Eddie Mars. He was the last obstacle standing between Rusty and the Sternwoods. That evening, I returned to his gambling house one last time. Eddie greeted me with his usual fake smile. Still chasing shadows, Marlowe? He asked. No, Eddie, I said. This is the end of the game. I know everything. Eddie's smile disappeared. He tried to act calm, but I could see he was worried. You don't scare me, Marlowe, he said. I stood my ground. Rusty is coming back. You can't stop him anymore. The general knows the truth, and he won't let you get away with this. Eddie glared at me, but didn't respond. He knew I wasn't bluffing. Without another word, I walked out, leaving him to think about his next move. I felt like the case was finally closing. Eddie's grip was loosening, and Rusty had a chance to return safely. Chapter 29. The next day, I returned to the Sternwood mansion. I told the general everything about Rusty hiding, Eddie Mars's involvement, and the danger Rusty was afraid of. The general listened quietly. He's afraid of Eddie, I said. But I think Rusty is ready to come back now. The general sighed. I just want him home. I don't care about the rest. Before I left, I reminded him to stay cautious. Eddie Mars wouldn't give up easily, but I was determined to protect Rusty and the Sternwood family. As I drove away, I felt the pieces of the case finally falling into place. The danger wasn't over, but I was ready to handle whatever came next. Chapter 30, I went to see Rusty one last time. I told him the general wanted him back and that I had dealt with Eddie Mars. Rusty looked relieved but still nervous. Are you sure it's safe? He asked. I can't promise Eddie won't try something, I said, but I'll make sure you're protected. Rusty thought about it for a moment, then nodded. It's time to stop hiding. I'll go back. I drove Rusty to the Sternwood mansion that evening. The general was waiting. When he saw Rusty, his face lit up. You're home, he said, his voice filled with relief. Rusty apologized for disappearing and promised to stay. The general was happy to have him back, and the tension in the house seemed to ease. As I left, I felt a sense of closure. The case was finally over. Eddie Mars had lost, and the Sternwood family could start to heal. Chapter 31. With Rusty back at the Sternwood mansion, I thought the case was over. But I still had a feeling that Eddie Mars wasn't done yet. I decided to watch his moves carefully. That night, I stayed near Eddie's gambling house. It was quiet for hours until I saw two of his men leave in a car. I followed them. They drove to a remote area outside the city. It was dark and silent. The men parked the car and waited. After a while, another car arrived. A man got out and handed them a bag. They talked briefly, then both cars left in different directions. I stayed hidden, unsure what had just happened. I followed one of the cars back to the city. It stopped at Eddie Mars's house. The men carried the bag inside. I couldn't see what was in it, but it looked heavy. I guessed it was either money or something illegal. I didn't confront them yet. Instead, I decided to wait and plan my next move. Eddie Mars was still a threat, and I wasn't ready to let my guard down. Chapter 32. The next day, I decided to check on Rusty at the Sternwood mansion. The general was happy to have him back, but something still felt off. I could tell Rusty was restless, like he was waiting for something to happen. I asked Rusty if Eddie Mars had tried to contact him. He shook his head. "Not yet," he said. "But I know he will." I reminded him. "You don't have to face him alone. If Eddie makes a move, I'll handle it." Rusty nodded, but I could see he was still nervous. Before I left, the general thanked me again for bringing Rusty home. "You've done more for me than I could ever ask," he said. As I drove away, I couldn't shake the feeling that Eddie Mars was planning something. I knew this wasn't over yet. This case had been full of lies, danger, and death. I had seen the worst sides of people, their greed, their fear, and their violence. Rusty Regan had returned, but many others were gone, like Geiger and Joe Brody. The general wouldn't live much longer, and soon he would join them in the Big Sleep. The Big Sleep, I thought, meant peace. No more troubles, no more lies. Just silence. Maybe it wasn't such a bad thing after all. As I drove through the quiet streets, I wondered if I had done the right thing. Had I really helped the Sternwoods, or had I just cleaned up their mess? I didn't know. All I knew was that the world kept spinning, and I had another day to face.